Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 53 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. Before the curtain rises on our episode today, I'd be grateful if you would consider becoming a patron of the podcast. Your support will help me to continue to make the podcast without the intrusion of advertising. Patrons also enjoy additional content about the plays we cover. For more information, please visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast. Thank you. The curtain rises on the ruins of a badly shelled village in the Caucasus, shortly following the Second World War. People from two of the local villages sit in a circle, accompanied by an expert from the Soviet State Reconstruction Committee. They are debating plans for the regeneration of their homeland, plans which they initially don't agree on, but which they hope will transform their futures. This doesn't sound like the most promising of theatrical premises, but after a few minutes the discussion reaches an amicable conclusion, and the expert introduces a famous singer who will lead some of the assembled group in the performance of a play. The play within the play that follows is a timeless tale of romance and war, a moving story of maternal love and a political parable, complete with songs and comic turns. It is a fable with a purpose, however, because its author's intention is to prompt us to consider the moral, social, and political points it makes with a view to changing our own world. The play is the Caucasian Chalk Circle, and the author, Bertolt Brecht, who is renowned for his distinctive dramatic philosophy, a philosophy that challenged the traditional relationship between theatrical artifice and its audience. Brecht wrote the first draft of the Caucasian Chalk Circle in 1944 while living in exile in the United States, but the final version was not completed until 1954, when he had returned to East Berlin and it was performed by his Berliner Ensemble Theater Company. It is now enjoying its first major London production for 25 years at the Rose Theatre in Kingston, in a new adaptation by Steve Waters, directed by the Rose's artistic director, Christopher Haydon. And I'm delighted that Christopher has taken time out to join me today to talk about Bertolt Brecht and this challenging, compelling, complicated, even crazy play. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Chris has been the artistic director of the Rose since January 2020. Prior to that, he was artistic director of the Gate Theatre in London for 5 years, and before that, he was associate director at the Bush Theatre. He also has a lengthy list of freelance directing credits, including Macbeth at Manchester Royal Exchange, The Remains of the Day at the Royal in Derngate, Northampton, and The Caretaker at the Bristol Old Vic, just to name a few. So, Chris, formalities over. My first question is, when did you first come across the Caucasian Chalk Circle, or the work of Bertolt Brecht, and what impression did it make on you? And then, what attracted you to this play to want to direct it now? Sorry, I think that's actually 3 questions.
I first came across Brecht, I think, when I was an A-level student doing theatre studies. He, along with Stanislavski, were 2 of the practitioners that you had to study. And they were a good pair to study together because, Stanislavski was all about hypernaturalism and hyperrealism, and Brecht was all about hypertheatricality, and in a way was kind of reacting against some of the values that had derived from Stanislavski's work. So, I first came across him when I was 16. And actually, we went as part of our school trip to see the last major production of Caucasian Chalk Circle.
Wow, where was that?
It was at the National, and it was directed by Simon McBurney, so it was a théâtre de complicité show. And McBurney directed it and played Asdak, and Juliet Stevenson played Grusha. And I remember enjoying it very much at the time, but I think I didn't really realize quite what an impact it had on me. And I didn't realize that, I think probably really until I started thinking about my own production of it. And I realized how that previous production had lived in my head for so many years. There were moments in that show. They had a puppet playing Michael, the boy. The puppet got bigger as the show went on. And there was an extraordinary moment towards the end when the chalk circle is drawn and they bring on this life-size puppet and lay it down in the circle. And then the puppet stood up of its own accord and took off the Hessian cloth that was making up the puppet's head, and it was a real little boy. I mean, it was proper magic. And I remember, the bridge crossing, they were using these wooden poles that would become a soldier's weapon or would become the waves of the sea. And then for the bridge crossing, all the actors put the poles on their shoulder and Grisha walked along the poles. So, the theatricality. And I remember McBurney being Asdak in a swivel chair, these really distinct images that have stayed with me forever as really specific theatrical moments. So that's when I first came across the play and came across Brecht. And then obviously I've seen a lot of Brecht over the years, and his ideas are profoundly influential on the whole of Western theatre, really, almost to a point where they're kind of part of the furniture now. And they perhaps don't have the radical aesthetic or political impact that he intended them to because they've become so familiar. Yeah, so that's sort of where the journey started. And then in terms of my production, when I started at the Rose, it's a beautiful, beautiful theatre. It's modelled on Shakespeare's Rose. So it's this big space that is modelled on this very ancient theatre, but it's all made out of concrete and steel. So it feels like a very contemporary space when you go in there. And it's an epic space that requires epic stories to be told. And I wanted to do something that really showed off the physical nature of that space and to do something that filled it emotionally and to do something that spoke politically to the time that we live in. And, Caucasian Chalk Circle is a play about hope arising from chaos. And we live in a chaotic world. Brexit has led to chaos. COVID led to chaos. We have a government that is currently an absolute chaotic mess. And there's now war in Europe again for the first time in many decades. So this notion of finding hope, this notion of looking for a way forward amongst this kind of chaos felt really important to me. And the play completely embodies that.
That's fantastic because there are two strands there, I think, which we'll talk a lot more about, which is that you were inspired by the theatricality of that national production and how inventive it is. And of course, this is, I guess, one of Brecht's purposes and techniques is to be self-conscious about the theatricality and to offer opportunity for creative theatricality, which you definitely use in your production. And we'll talk more about his philosophy in a minute. And the other bit was about the political message that's intended. He definitely intended there to be political messages in his plays. And we'll also talk more about those themes that are in this particular play and how they resonate to today. But you've certainly hit the nail on the head of some of it because, it is about chaos and war and the victims of war. I'll be interested to talk to you when we get towards the end about how much hope you think is in there, but I'm glad that you think there is some. I don't know how much we need to go into, or about where this play came from in Brecht's life. And who was Bertolt Brecht? I mean, you as a theater practitioner have studied and know him well, but...
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't claim to be an expert on Brecht's life. He's best known for being a very political playwright. I don't think he was ever actually a member of the Communist Party, but he definitely had strong communist sympathies. But he was also a kind of arch pragmatist. I mean, he fled his home and ended up in America, where he was asked to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he agreed to testify, which itself would have been seen as a political betrayal in some ways. I think he said he did it on the advice of lawyers and whatever. And he was quite irreverent and flippant during his testimony. But what I find interesting about him is that people kind of assume that he's this very stoic, dour figure. He wasn't. He was wily and he was pragmatic and also very controversial. I mean, again, not something I know a huge amount, but I think, there's all sorts of controversies around how he related to some of the women in his life, both in terms of his personal and sexual relationships, but also in terms of a creative relationship and whether or not the women in his life contributed considerably more to his work than is widely admitted. So I think one must be careful not to sanctify him by any means, but there's a brilliant raucous energy to his work, which I think mirrors his life. And I think with the Caucasian Chalk Circle, he wrote it in 1948. And I only discovered the other day that actually the first production happened in America at a college in America. We have a lot of school groups coming to see the show at the Rose, and it will probably be for some of those school students their first experience of seeing Brecht for real. So it's kind of appropriate that the play they're seeing was itself first performed in a college environment and not done at the Berliner Ensemble until several years later, just a couple of years before his death.
Yes. So he was born in Germany in 1898. And as you say, basically had some communist sympathies. But during the 30s, of course, he was very much out of favor with the Nazis. And in fact, in 1933, after the Nazis came to power, and even the night of the burning of the Reichstag, he fled Germany and ended up ultimately going to the United States during the war in 1941, where he wrote the first version of the Caucasian Chalk Circle. And as you say, it was performed somewhere in a college in Minnesota. But it wasn't the final version, because he actually went back to Germany after the war and settled in East Berlin. And he was very much sympathetic to the Soviet model of politics and thought that it offered hope for reconstruction of East Germany, obviously destroyed in the war. And as you say, he must have had both pragmatism but also integrity just to survive, because he stuck to his political principles in Germany and then thereafter when he went back to Germany. So he was a survivor in that sense, I guess.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, in terms of where this play itself comes from, the play is about war and surviving war. It opens with these refugees, as I described initially. And in a sense, he was a refugee coming back to his homeland that had been destroyed and divided by the war. Before we go further, I think for listeners who are not familiar with the play, I wonder if we give them a brief outline of the main story of the play, Chris. I'd referred in the introduction to the opening scene, which serves as a sort of prologue. There's not much plot to speak of in that opening, and we can come back to the purpose of that opening and its way it's structured in a minute. But perhaps we could just summarize the highlights of the story with the play within the play.
I mean, it's essentially two stories. It's almost two plays. So the first story is the story of Grusha Vashnadze, who is a young woman who works as a maid in the court of Governor Georgi Abashvili and his wife Natalia Abashvili. And she's a kitchen maid. And then the revolution breaks out, a revolution that has been brought about by the governor's brother, the Bearded Prince. In our version called the Bearded Prince, I think in the original called the Fat Prince. And so the revolution breaks out, the governor is killed, the governor's wife flees, and the governor's wife, being self-involved and selfish and shallow, accidentally leaves behind her baby, a little baby called Michael.
As one does.
Yeah. And it's chaos. And in a chaotic place, chaotic things happen. And so the baby is abandoned. And Grusha finds the baby and can't leave it alone. And so once she realizes that nobody's coming to rescue the child, she takes the child away for herself. And she has to flee because she knows that there are soldiers who have been sent by the Bearded Prince to find the baby and kill it, because the baby is an heir to the governor's throne, as it were. So Grusha is fleeing and she's being hunted by these soldiers. And she goes on this epic adventure. It's a real thrill ride. She ends up trying to pretend that she's incredibly rich and posh and tag along with these two posh ladies, but then she's discovered and she runs away from there. And then she decides she can't keep the baby, so she leaves the baby at a farmstead with a farmer's wife. But then the soldiers find her, follow her back to the farmhouse and try and take the baby. And the farmer's wife, who initially seemed really protective of the child, then gives the baby up in order to protect herself. So Grusha attacks one of the soldiers and flees with the baby. And then she has to cross a bridge over a 2,000-foot drop, and the bridge is creaking and about to collapse. She risks her own life and the child's life in order to escape the soldiers. And eventually she gets to her brother where she's been fleeing to, but her brother's wife is really awful and doesn't want her to stay. So then she has to go and marry this person who's meant to be on his deathbed, and that will at least mean that the child will have some kind of legitimacy. But then the person realizes he's not on his deathbed. He's actually been faking his own death in order to get out of big war. And so then she's married to this terrible man. And then Simon, her fiance, who we met at the beginning of the show and who's gone off to war, comes back to hopefully get back together with her and discovers that she's married and discovers that she has this child and thinks that she's been having sex out of wedlock, which when the play is set would have been a great sin. And so he's incredibly upset. And then the baby at the end of the first act gets taken away by a soldier to be returned to Natalia Abashvili now that the revolution is over and she's back in power. And that's just the first half of the show.
Yeah.
The second half of the show starts somewhere completely different. We meet Azdak, who is this weird man living a kind of hermit-like existence. And he's just found this refugee who's fleeing for his life during the chaos. And he protects the refugee, but then he learns that the refugee is actually the Grand Duke, so the governor's boss, someone else who was overthrown. And Azdak feels so terrible that he protected this rich tyrant that he hands himself in at the court and says, "Put me on trial." But because of the revolution, the court system's completely broken down, and there's just a couple of psychotic soldiers who are in the court who almost kill him. And then when the Bearded Prince turns up, the same guy from the first act, trying to install his nephew as judge, the soldiers decide that actually Azdak should be the judge, and they scare the Bearded Prince and his nephew away with their guns, because by this point, all sense of authority is broken down. Outback then becomes this chaotic judge who makes decisions that have no relationship to the word of the law. He's a bit of a Robin Hood figure. He's kind of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, but he's also taking bribes from anyone who'll give them to him. He's a very unpredictable figure. And then in the final scene of the show, everything comes together and there's a trial to decide who is the true mother of the child that Grusha rescued. Is it Grusha or is it Natalia Abashvili? And they argue it out in court. And then Azdak decides the only way they can decide is to draw a chalk circle on the floor, hence the title of the play. And he puts the child in the middle and he asks both mothers to pull the child out of the circle. So it's very much a wisdom of Solomon thing from the Bible, where Solomon threatened to cut a baby in half to decide who the true mother was. And Grusha just can't bring herself to harm the child by pulling him out the circle. It's just she gives him up twice. And it's at that point Azdak says, right, well, the true mother has to be you because you won't harm the child. And then Azdak vanishes and Grusha and Simon get back together and they keep the child with them and they live happily ever after. So it's a huge story. It's a kind of insane, wonderful joyride of a story. And it's about motherhood and the law and justice and courage and all these things. And it's just wonderful.
It is. And a wonderful telling. You've just given a fantastic telling. It made me feel even more like it's a fairy tale in form in some way, isn't it?
It is. It's a morality tale, definitely. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about the form of the play, the structure, because as you said just now, it's almost like two stories in one. But also, let's start with this first scene I described, which is not even part of that fairy tale story. It's a prologue, which Brecht entitled The Struggle for the Valley. And I introduced these refugees who are coming back to their land. It was Grusinia, which is in fact a Russian variant for Georgia in the Caucasus. But they're coming back after the war. The war has devastated their land. And they have this, kind of dry debate with this Soviet representative about what should happen and what the investment in their land should be and the things. And then there's a singer is introduced, as I said at the beginning, who then tells the story that you've just relayed as a sort of play within the play. And in fact, the people are supposed to perform that story. But I was puzzled as to what the purpose of this prologue was, because the opening scene, to be perfectly honest, certainly in text, less so in your production, I would say, is somewhat dry and opaque, and it doesn't really go anywhere thereafter. And there's only the very briefest reference at the end of the play back to these people in this debate. So what is the structural connection between this opening and the story you've just told?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, I think, well, it's interesting. Somebody sent me as a gift an English language copy of the play from 1954 or 56. And I opened it and I was really struck to see that the prelude scene was not in it. So it just starts with the singer saying, "In bloody days long passed away, the city sat in a valley," which is the opening of the story. I mean, to be honest, I can't give you an answer as to why Brecht chose to introduce the scene with farmers as he did. But certainly in our version, Steve reimagined it set in a refugee camp, and that we were looking at a group of refugees who were arguing amongst themselves and working out what it would mean to get home and how to live once they're home and, on land that's been destroyed. And that feels really relevant because, it is a story of refugees. Grusha is a refugee. I mean, technically, you might say she's an internally displaced person because she doesn't actually leave the country she's in, but she's a forced migrant. She's forced from her home by violence. And that is something that feels incredibly relevant to the world that we live in now, the refugee crisis that we're facing now. And so, to me, there's a very clear thematic link in our version between the prelude and the rest of the play. But yeah, it is weird in the original. And in the original, he barely comes back to the prelude at the end. It's like he's kind of forgotten about the framing device.
Yeah.
I can't give you an answer as to...
No, well, that was good because I think I read somewhere that he added it later.
Yeah.
And it seems to me a slightly clumsy device to make a political point or to make us think more about some of the themes that he wants us to think about. And your updating, I thought, worked tremendously well because, as you say, it's so timely. I mean, it's so familiar to us as an image.
Yeah.
And I'd actually like the way in your production you did tie up the prologue in the end by having the child in the prologue section. You have an unaccompanied minor walk through the refugee camp at the start. And then that doubles as Grusha's son at the end. So we do make that connection.
I've done a lot of work in different ways, artistically and campaigningly in different ways on refugee issues over my life. And some years ago, I visited the jungle in Calais, where the Good Chance Theatre was set up. The guys that set up the Good Chance then went on to write the play The Jungle, and now they're doing Little Amal, which is the puppet that's walking across the world, young Syrian girl. And, you go to the jungle in Calais and there are unaccompanied children. There are a lot of under 18s who have no family, who have no parents with them, teenage boys, some younger than that. And it's horrifying. And again, you think about it with, in America under Trump, the separation of children from their parents at the Mexican border, like that, the notion of a child that's been separated deliberately or accidentally from his parents. And I'm the father of two very small children. I've got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, both boys. And so I think for me, above anything else, the play is a play about motherhood or parenthood specifically. That notion of a child without its parents, a child without anyone to protect them is just very visceral and very emotional and goes beyond any more specific political interpretation you might give. I just think it's a very human story.
I was very struck by that in the performance because, as I recall, the child walks through the camp.
Yeah.
And people try to talk to it, but it's mute. It doesn't respond and then just walks away. So we don't know who this child is.
Yeah.
He hasn't answered. They can't figure out who it is. That's very disturbing.
Yeah.
I've come back to the other thing about the form of the play, which is that, as we've said several times, it's a play within the play. And interestingly, when I opened the text, there was a list of all the characters in this play, and there were like 50 characters. I may be wrong, but it seemed like that many. And you staged it with 9 actors, is that right, to perform all these?
Yeah, 9 actors, not including the child. Yeah.
Right. And so I wondered, I didn't see anything in the published text from Brecht to indicate how you're supposed to cover these 50 roles. But obviously, it is a play within the play, and he refers to the fact that some of the people in the prologue are going to be involved in the performance. So there's something self-conscious, obviously, about the fact that you're putting on the play. What do you think the point of him doing this as a play within a play is? What difference does that make to how we respond to it or how you direct it as well?
Well, I think Brecht's whole philosophy was about drawing attention to the artifice of the theatrical event. He was reacting against an aesthetic culture, a theatre culture that wanted you to become completely engrossed in a show and believe that you were actually in the living room with the bourgeois couple who were arguing over a cup of tea. And this sounds kind of quaint now, in the same way that when you go see Hamlet and you hear them say to be or not to be, and you go, oh God, it's such a cliche. But it's a cliche because it's so successful. It wasn't a cliche when Shakespeare wrote it, but now it's so familiar. It's the same with Brecht's ideas. He wanted to draw an audience's attention to the fact they were in a theatre and remind them that they were watching a story that wasn't real. You go, but we do that all the time now. We have TV and film where characters regularly break the fourth wall. And I've seen TV shows where characters literally walk off the set and beyond the camera, So that notion of being self-conscious about storytelling or meta-theatrical is deeply, deeply familiar to us now, but it wasn't in Brecht's time, as far as I know. So I think the play within the play device, in one respect, does that. It's saying to you as an audience member, what you're seeing isn't real. And I think one thing that I'm really struck by when I was reading the play is that he writes 2 different kinds of characters. There are some characters that are complex, psychologically real, 3-dimensional human beings. Grusha, her fiancé Simon, and Azdak are the most obvious ones. But then lots of other characters in the play are not that. They are very deliberately archetypal, caricatured characters. And in a way, for me, it feels like there's a strong overlap between what he was doing and our tradition of pantomime. And certainly in my production, we lean into a lot of very broad humor, characters defined by a hat or a prop or whatever, and then by a strong vocal choice with an accent or a strong physical choice. And partly that's because we've got so much doubling happening, actors playing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more roles. And so the audience need to very quickly know, oh, now they're a different person. And some of our actors are playing 3 different characters in one scene. And look, the choice to have 9 actors was nothing more than a financial one. If I could have afforded a cast of 20, I would have done. But, you cut your cloth to fit your means and actually you then go, okay, well, the doubling can really allow us to lean into these kind of theatrical choices that the actors are making in terms of how they perform. And again, leans into the sort of Brechtian idea of reminding the audience that they're watching a play, that they're watching actors.
Yeah.
And so in a way, at any one time, you're watching an actor be three people on stage. They are the actor, the person they are actually in real life. They are the refugee from the beginning of the story, and then they are the character that that refugee is playing in the telling of the story, in what we're told is a kind of participatory piece of theatre. So I think also maybe what Brecht is doing, although, like you say, the ending of the play traditionally doesn't really refer back to the opening prelude. I wonder whether there's also an argument for the value of theatre and storytelling in the play, because the idea is that the play is meant to help these, in our case, refugees who can't agree at the beginning, find a way of agreeing, find a way of finding common ground. And so it's hopeful in that it's saying that art, storytelling can do that.
Yes, that's fantastic because it does say, actually, just on that point, that the singer who introduces the play within the play says that it will have some bearing on their problem.
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be instructional, I guess, in some sense. And I think you've definitely made a virtue out of the budget in terms of the multiple roles, because that is very much, as you said, Brecht's intent. His ideas were collated under an umbrella term of epic theater, which doesn't necessarily mean scale or scope, but rather this form where he's deliberately not encouraging an audience to suspend their disbelief and to break that fourth wall, as you said, with the purpose that we're supposed to remain rational and not, as in Aristotle's definition of empathy that we're supposed to have. And also contrary, I suppose, to the psychological realism, as you mentioned Stanislavski in the beginning. But also he used some devices, like we haven't talked about the singer particularly, but the singer is essentially a narrator who speaks directly to the audience.
Yeah.
And I read somewhere that even at times, I don't know whether you considered this, he had placards with the titles of each scene. And at one point, there was even a placard instructing people not to stare so romantically at the stage. So you're supposed to retain some form of intellectual distance to be making judgments and thinking about the themes and things that are being raised.
Placards are, like when you study theatre studies A-level and you talk about Brecht, you're told about the placards and it's a way of announcing the scene. And I think I very deliberately steered away from that because that does feel like quite a specific Brecht cliche. And also the singer, Zoe, who plays the singer in our show, she announced, she goes, episode 1, the Lights on All the Mountains. And so we have that announcing. I mean, one of the things that's curious about the play that I only really properly realized when we actually got into rehearsals is the singer tells you what's going to happen and they tell you in the present tense. So they don't say, we're about to see a scene where XYZ happens. They go, right now the governor is doing this and this is happening and this is happening. And then you see the scene happen. So it's kind of jarring because you have to, as an audience member, get used to the fact that you're told what's happening and then you see what's happening. So there's a lot of doubling up in that regard, which is slightly curious. But the singer's a great character. And it's funny, I had a sort of realization quite late in rehearsals. And you'd never get this from watching the show, but I've decided it's definitely the truth. I decided that the singer is Michael. The little boy that is rescued grows up to become a storyteller. And that the singer is telling their own story. And that's why the singer is so invested in it. And I don't know, like if we were doing the show again, I'd love to talk to Steve about a tweak to the script or something in the design that makes that more apparent, because I just love this idea that actually the whole story is autobiographical.
I think that's brilliant.
And I'm not saying that was what Brecht intended. That's just what I've decided.
Well, no, because I read somewhere, did you say already that the same actor plays the singer in Azdak, although I don't know whether they're on the stage at the same time at some point?
Yes, that is done quite a lot. We didn't do that.
I think you were right not to do that. The other thing I was going to say about the play within the play form, and actually particularly your 9 actors, as I thought it had this wonderful feel, a bit like a commedia dell'arte show, or, Boccaccio and Canterbury Tales and all that kind of genre of storytelling.
Yeah.
Where there's a series of different tales that are told, and the actors use whatever they've got in terms of props to improvise and deliver this story. And this ties into what you're saying about the characters, that they're stock characters in some ways, in the way commedia characters are stock characters that represent certain social strata, and which Brecht is parodying, of course, in the royalty, the judge, the soldiers, doctors, peasants, which you get in commedia. They're not the very specific commedia characters, but the similar sort of stock approach, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, you end up with, as we said at the beginning, a sort of fairy tale, don't you, where it's this heroine's exile and journey through woods,
yeah,
and wicked princes and peasants and the lovers struggling to be together and all that. All of which sounds like great fun. But when you research Brecht, and actually when I said to my wife, Chris, we're going to see Brecht, her heart sank.
Yeah, I know.
She thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be dreary and preachy. So this reputation for his style of theater, that it's going to be a political polemic and we're not supposed to actually get emotionally involved, it's not entirely true though, is it? I mean, first of all, I would say that your show in particular is very funny as well, and boisterous, physical comedy, music. So it's not all so deeply.
The play is very funny. I think this idea that you're not meant to get emotionally involved. I mean, again, like I don't know whether Brecht said that or whether that's something that's lost in translation, but it's nonsense. Like, he wrote a story about a woman rescuing a child and having to prove she's the child's mother. That is an emotional story. And so many of his stories are emotional. You know, Galileo is a story about a man standing up for his beliefs and being threatened with death for it. They are emotional stories. The theatre is a physical medium, and emotions are physical things. So the idea that you're not meant to have an emotional involvement, I think, is, if Brecht meant it, he was wrong, and it isn't manifest in the plays that he wrote. And if he didn't mean it, then he's been misunderstood. I think part of the problem is the sort of notion of the Fremdung effect and alienation. It sounds so awful, but all it means is a distancing. Like, again, it's an understanding of the space that exists between you and the story you're seeing. But the thing is, that is so common now. I think he is a victim of his own success, in both in the terms of his ideas are now so embedded in our culture that they don't necessarily have the impact that he wanted them to anymore. But he's also a victim of his own success in that he has this kind of reputation that is just nonsense. Look, you know, to put it crudely, Azdak has a big speech at the beginning of Act 2 about watching a pasha, a powerful man in Iran, fart very loudly at a feast. You know, that is not a speech written by somebody who wanted the audience to have a terribly serious time in the theatre. The play is very funny. It's very entertaining. So this notion that Brecht is meant to be terribly dour and serious and very German, I think, is really unfortunate. And for me, casting a brilliant performer like Carrie Hope Fletcher as Grusha was, you know, we cast her because she's an amazing actor and an amazing singer and a brilliant match for the role. But also, she has a reputation for musical theatre. She will have an audience that wouldn't necessarily go and see Brecht. And the idea is to kind of give an audience access to a play and a story and show it to them in a way that they wouldn't necessarily expect. And, you know, I hope we've done that. Certainly, we get a lot of laughter in the show, and there's a very warm response.
Absolutely. And you're right, it is funny, and it is funny in the text too. There's no doubt that he's parodying these people. And also, it's just great storytelling.
Yeah.
So there's no way you don't get involved in great storytelling. And I'm glad you mentioned Carrie, because she brings a fantastic emotional depth. And this goes back to, and I want to explore a little bit more, your point about the different types of characters. Because as I was preparing for this conversation, I thought to myself, okay, there's usually a section where we talk about the characters in some depth, thinking about the nuances of their relationships, their objectives, the psychological journey they go on. And then I started thinking about the characters in this play, and I thought, well, there aren't very many of those sorts of things to be talked about.
Yeah.
And as you said, there are relatively few who aren't caricatures or just snapshots of a character that are drawn really quickly, because there are a lot of them. And we get the idea, as you said, when they just put on a certain hat or voice, you understand who they are. But that's not the case with, as you say rightly, Grusha, Simon, and particularly Azdak. But Grusha, how would you describe what the character of Grusha is about? What's important about her? Why does she have more depth than the others?
She is a woman who dresses herself in thick emotional armor. Her opening scene with Simon, he's being really flirtatious and she's blunt and dismissive and tries to get rid of him. And then the second scene, when the war is breaking out, the revolution is erupting, and the scene where he proposes to her, he finally gets down on his knees and says, "Will you marry me?" And her response is, "Yeah, fine by me." I mean, and then he offers her his mother's necklace, and then she's genuinely overwhelmed emotionally. She's a woman who does not allow herself to share her emotions easily. She's tough. And then she meets this baby, and it melts her, and the baby gets under her skin. There's a beautiful moment when she leaves the baby at the farmer's wife's house and knocks on the door and runs away, so the farmer's wife takes the baby in. And the singer says to her, "Why so happy marching away?" And she says, "Because the child has a family." And then the singer says, "Why so sad marching away?" And she says, "Because now I feel lonely." I mean, I feel emotional just saying that. Conflict in that character about trying to work out what the best thing to do is and how do you live and how do you survive. But just her absolute determination. And she doesn't take the child as a conscious act of heroism. She does it because she has to. She has no choice. No one else is going to take the child and she can't leave it. You know, it's like when somebody does something incredibly heroic, like they run into a burning building and save a child. And they often say, I didn't feel like a hero. I just did what felt right. I just followed my instincts. I'm not a hero. And Grusha would absolutely say that. She would absolutely say, I'm not a hero. I just did what I had to do. And then at the end, she's like, that child is mine. And I think there's something quite radical there as well about family being about, if we're talking Brecht, if we're going to get proper Marxist, it's about social relations rather than biology. The social relationship that exists between Michael and Grusha is more powerful than the biological one that exists between Natalia and Michael. And that notion that the social conditions are what define who we are is, you know, we're getting into proper Marxist territory now and proper Brecht. But in a way, what he's done is he's taken that and put it in a profoundly emotional setting, which is why it goes back to this thing that the idea that you're not meant to have an emotional reaction to Brecht is utter nonsense. Even if that's what he thought he wanted his audience to have, he was wrong about his own work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's brilliant about you saying about Grusha and Simon, because you're right. You're puzzled initially as to her reaction because you're thinking, come on, girl.
Yeah.
And then that moment where she breaks, so to speak, and she promises that she'll wait for him. It's a beautiful speech. There's a line where she says, the pillow next to me will be uncreased. I will wait. But she's also, as you say, I mean, it may be a sort of fairy tale sense, but there is a depth to her. Determination was one of the words I wrote down, and integrity and endurance. And she's an ordinary person. What you were saying earlier about ordinary heroes who run into the building. She's very ordinary. And in fact, at one stage, she says, I can't do this. And she leaves the baby on the doorstep of the hut. So, she's not perfect, but a portrait of a strong woman who also finds herself in this horrible bind where she hasn't got a future because she hasn't got a husband, but she has a baby, and her brother and sister-in-law essentially force her to marry. So, as you say, a very strong character. And the other strong character in the play is Azdak.
Yeah.
Now, he's completely different. He's eccentric and rebellious, and in Jonathan Slinger's storming performance, he completely dominates the second half of the play. But he's a contrary fellow, a sort of lord of misrule, isn't he? How do you come to terms with what he is? He's complicated.
Well, the defining thing about him is that he finds out he's been harboring the Grand Duke as a refugee, and so he hands himself in for trial.
Why does he do that? It seems a perverse thing to do, doesn't it?
Well, he's a perverse character. Shalva at the beginning says, I know you're a decent soul. And he's like, how dare you call me a decent soul? I'm Azdak, master contrarian. And one of the things that John Slinger and I discussed in rehearsals was he said he felt that Azdak was probably a former spy. And that's why he was at this feast for the Pasha in Iran, or why he's got all these stories about places he's been. And John was, I think he used to be a spy and now he's in hiding. I quite like that idea. Again, like a character who wears a mask upon a mask upon a mask. But also we talked about free climbing. And there was that documentary about that amazing free climber who climbs without any rope, and if he slipped, he'd die. And I was saying, is there something about Azdak that he hands himself in order to then try and justify his position and get himself off? Is he somebody who's just drawn to the argument? He's drawn to the next big challenge. But also, I think somebody who's driven to do good against their better judgment almost. He wants the bribes. He wants the power that being a judge brings him. Actually, he can't help but make the right decision. And this is now going to be a very, very weird curveball, so feel free to cut it out. But my partner and I are currently rewatching all the Harry Potter films. And although they're completely different in some ways psychologically, the character that I find most fascinating is Snape, Severus Snape. And the reason is because he too does what is right against all of his instincts. He hates Harry, but he does the right thing by Harry up to the point where he sacrifices his life. That idea that somebody does what's right, even though every sinew in their body is screaming against it, is fascinating. It feels to me like Azdak is the same thing. He's a contrarian and he wants to do one thing, but then his instinct won't let him. They'll take him somewhere else. I know Steve feels that Brecht probably identified a lot with Azdak. And again, that sort of pragmatism and that contrarianism. I mean, there's at one point when the revolution comes to an end and the 700 days, what's he said, his happy time of misrule or whatever the phrase is, when he realizes that he might end up going to prison for having been such a naughty judge. And there are people coming, and he thinks they're soldiers coming to arrest him. And he says to Shao that I will not give them the satisfaction of bravado. I am down on my knees begging for my life.
Yes.
This by the, communist sympathizing playwright who agreed to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. I will not give them the satisfaction of bravado. I'm going to do what I can to survive. And I don't think one should ever criticize people for doing what they need to survive.
No, and it's amazing, though, that you say that he's also a bit heroic. I mean, he makes the ultimate decision, of course, which obeys some form of natural justice rather than institutional law. But he's obviously no hero. In other ways, he's corrupt and crude and
drunk.
Yeah, drunk, lacking in courage. Although it's interesting, maybe that bit about being a spy, one of the justifications for his turning himself in was that he identifies in this new regime, there's this cycle of new regimes, and he's smart enough to see the way the world turns.
Yeah.
And that any dissenters will be hunted down, he'll be found out. So he better get on the front foot. If he confesses first and he ingratiates himself with the new powers, he might just escape. A fascinating character who's, as you say, against his better judgment. He's always making the decisions in favor of those who are less well off.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is he a voice of Brecht himself?
It's interesting, you could say like a kind of Robin Hood figure who takes from the rich and gives to the poor. And that's sort of right. I'd like to think that he's slightly more complex than that. He's a Robin Hood figure who takes from the rich and gives to the poor after he's had his own cut.
Well, yeah. And some of his judgments, actually, frankly, I was hard-pressed to follow the logic of his thinking anyway.
Yeah.
It just seemed a bit chaotic in itself. And, of course, it's a classic portrait of a time of chaos.
Yeah.
When the wrong people are in charge. You mentioned these soldiers at the beginning who just ultimately decide, okay, you're the judge. Everybody's unqualified in the world where everything's fallen apart. And speaking of the world falling apart, there's clearly some political messages we could find in this play that Brecht intended. And I wondered what you thought the most important ones of those are.
I think it's a really good question. I think that you could say that for Brecht, the important messages are literally just what the final lines of the play are. Let children go to the maternal that they may flourish. Let the weapons go to the peacemakers that they may rust. Let the water go to the valley that it may become lush. In a way, it's proper communist, like to each according to his need. But for me, the message of the play is about the need to choose actively what is right, whether that means an active choice to take a baby or whether that means an active choice when making a legal decision to go with what is right rather than what sounds right or what the law demands. That the rules and structure of the world that we live in are often deeply flawed and that we have to take personal moral responsibility for the way that we navigate them. So I feel like it's a play that's much more a moral fable rather than a political one. I mean, you could be a hardcore right-winger and you'd be hard pushed, I think, not to think that Grusha should keep the baby at the end. So even if you disagree with all of Brecht's politics, that notion that actually she is the true mother because she made the right choice, she invested in that relationship, seems to me to be pretty unanswerable and transcends a left-right divide. But maybe I'm being too hopeful there.
No, I think that's interesting. It made me think, actually, that there's several different levels on which the play works. And that's, I suppose, analogous to what you were saying earlier about the types of characters and our involvement as well. Because there's some very obvious targets Brecht comes up with, aren't there, in political terms, like class, capitalism, the class differences between the governor and his wife, and they're utterly unmindful of the condition the people live in and planning to build an extension to their palace by wiping out the slums. And the governor's wife, when she's supposed to flee, can't leave her dresses behind.
Yeah.
And then in terms of capitalism, we have all sorts of things where people are driven by money. Of course, we had the judge, Yazdak, you say, taking the bribes. But even when Grusha knocks on the peasant's door and asks for milk and he wants to overcharge her, and you're thinking, why is he doing that? And Brecht's answer would be because this is what capitalism breeds. This is what the system's about. Everyone needs to fight their financial corner on those terms.
And I think one of the things that's really key about the play is that he doesn't do that thing that you might think he would do where working people are all noble and rich people are all terrible.
No.
People at all levels of society in his story can be horrifyingly self-serving, whether it's the rich ladies or the governor and his wife, or whether it's Yusef, who's this kind of poor man who's pretending to be dying so he can avoid conscription, and then finds himself married to Grusha and treats her in an appallingly misogynistic way. I mean, one of the reviews we got criticized the show for using regional accents in a sort of comedy way, and that's a kind of trope. And my response to that is yes, it was a very deliberate choice. It is a trope to use accents in a particular way, but we're doing it in a context where you can have a terribly badly behaved man with a broad Yorkshire accent and a terribly badly behaved woman with an incredibly cut glass RP accent. And the point that Brecht is making is that people at any level on the social ladder can behave in a very self-interested way, but equally you find kindness and generosity in unexpected places. I mean, when Grusha goes to cross the bridge, these two merchants, these are merchants, they're capitalists. That's what they do. They buy and sell for profit. They're not the kind of people that Brecht would necessarily empathize with. And yet they treat Grusha with real kindness and real support and real concern for her. And they try and stop her doing this thing that is incredibly dangerous. They offer to protect the baby for her. And you're not given any sense that their interest is anything other than altruistic in relation to her. So,
yes,
he allows the social world that he depicts to be both comically simplistic and also complex at the same time. And he leans into these archetypes and allows you to laugh at working class characters as much as you laugh at posh characters. And that is okay, because ultimately what defines these people isn't their class, it's their humanity or lack thereof.
Yeah, and I think there's a deliberate point there from what I was reading, is that thinking about this as a strict Marxist class war, he presents many examples, as you've just said, of working class people failing to act constructively together, or even to act with human decency and integrity towards each other. And I think his argument would be that it's the iniquity of hierarchical power and the type of society that we've created that creates poverty and fear that leads to self-preservation above all else.
Yeah.
And in fact, we can see that in all sorts of ways today. When times are getting tougher and resources are more scarce, then actually people start to behave not so well at times.
Yeah.
More looking after themselves, finding targets for who's responsible. So, it could be immigrants are responsible. So they end up targeting them. The other thing I thought was interesting, and again, I think suggested partly by the way you set the prologue, was that there's this sense, isn't there, of this repeating cycle of revolution and war and political nonsense, but with very real victims that goes on through history and around the world. Azdak talks about previous regimes in Persian War, where the same sort of chaos went on, and the same things happened. And isn't there that sense that this is just going round and round in a circle?
Absolutely. And it actually makes me think of Ivo van Hove's production, The Roman Tragedies, which took 3 of Shakespeare's Roman plays. What you had in those plays was you had this notion of every single time a character died, they would die in the middle of the stage. It was a camera above them, so you'd see the death on a video screen. And this repeated motif of somebody dying, somebody dying, somebody dying, a play finishes and another play starts, and it's the same cycle of violence, the same cycle of violence. And at the end of the show, they play The Times They Are A-Changing by Bob Dylan, and that becomes bitterly ironic because actually the times don't change. The cycle of violence persists, and there will be Grushas. There are Grushas all over the world right now.
In Iran.
Yeah, in Iran, in Ukraine, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, wherever, people doing small and large acts of heroism to survive against impossible odds.
It's an interesting, you mentioned the moral fable, as you described it, at the core of it, based on Grusha and her role as a mother, and the integrity towards each other. This is a theme, actually, I've just done The Crucible, and ultimately in Salem, it all depended on some sort of moral integrity on the part of ordinary people towards each other. I was going to ask, actually, one of my final questions was why this ostensibly Marxist play written 80 years ago speaks to us today. And I think we've been answering that question all the way through, because Steve's adaptation definitely updates it. In true Brechtian fashion, I would say, he makes direct relevance to some of the things that are happening in our own world. There's a phrase, special military operation, and that the reconstruction team will build back better, and there's references to oligarchs. So, he's obviously ticking some boxes in a Brechtian way to say, look, this is relevant to our time.
I mean, the refugee setting, I think, gives a very clear contemporary hook, but the underlying story is a timeless one. At the beginning, the singer says, play set in a place far away from here, in a time far away from here. It's a mishmash. It's a parable, a fable, a tragedy, a comedy. It draws from every culture. The whole point that the singer makes at the beginning is that there is a timeless quality to this story. I don't think we'll ever live in a world where people aren't having to engage in acts of heroism to make the world around them a little bit better. So I think it will always be relevant.
You mentioned earlier Grusha saying she just had to do this. And there was one of the lines that jumped out at me, which was, someone must be the helper.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Now, before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests if they could recommend another play that we could talk about in a future episode, or something that's just a personal favorite, because I love to hear about plays that other people love. I know as a theater director, that's a virtually impossible question, but is there one you might want to volunteer?
I've got two.
Oh, great.
So first one is Black Watch by Gregory Burke. I mean, it'd be interesting to talk about it just as a play, actually, because I saw it in 2006 in Edinburgh, and it is the best piece of theatre I've ever seen. Very influenced by John McGrath's work, and he was a Marxist theatre maker from Scotland. Very influenced by Brecht, this show, but it was about the Black Watch Regiment, and it's a really extraordinary piece of theatre. And yeah, I mean, it was remarkable. So that, and then the other play, which is a play I deeply, deeply love, and really should be revived, is The Drowned World by Gary Owen, which Payne's Plough produced in, I think, 2002. Vicky Featherstone directed it. It was at the Traverse in Edinburgh. And it's a play about living in a dystopian future where beauty has been made illegal. And there are four characters. Two of them are radiants, which means they are beautiful, and two of them are non-radiants, which means they're not. And the radiants are on the run because of their beauty. They have been made refugees. And one of the non-radiants hides them, and the other non-radiant is a secret police person trying to find them. It's a brilliant, poetic, beautiful, extraordinary play. I love it. Both of those plays are remarkable.
What a fantastic concept. Wow. I love that idea.
Really, I'm amazed it's never been revived. It's a gorgeous play.
Oh, well, I'll definitely look that up. And Chris, you should do it. Why don't you revive it?
Well, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been great talking to you, and congratulations on the production. It's a great show. If you get a chance, go and see it, because sometimes these only come around every 25 years. Great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
As the curtain falls, what instruction have we taken from the play, as Brecht intended? It is a reminder, as if we needed one, of the abuses of wealth and power, of corrupt regimes and institutions, of the brutalities of war, and the millions of victims of conflict over cycles of history, all of which are still so prevalent in our world. But Brecht may give us some hope with the fairy tale ending of the play. Love triumphs in bringing the truly caring mother and child together, as well as the young lovers. But Brecht also wants us to see with clear eyes both the highs and lows in our own natures, and the dangers in our social and political beliefs. As he enjoined, don't stare romantically. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the Play Review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theater going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.